Hello everybody, and Happy New Year. Welcome back to the people that have been to the First Thursday clubs before, and welcome to anybody that's new to this. As the name suggests, we've been running webinars and seminars for the first Thursday of each month. Today, we're going to be hearing from one of our directors, Jon Davies. I should say I'm Tim Hounsome. I'm the Managing Director of RSK Biosensors. Jon has been an ecological consultant for 25 years, working for Cresswell Associates, Hyder Consulting, Arcadis, and now RSK Biosensors. In a previous life, he worked for the Natural History Museum Biodiversity Division, studying beetles and diversity of beetles in the tropics, and is currently writing a book about his adventures. In 2020, Jon was made a Fellow of the Chartered Institute for Ecology and Environmental Management. And he says in 2019, in September, he got drunk at a party and promised some bloke he could rewild his estate for him. RSK Wilding was born out of that discussion. It's true. Before I hand over to Jon, there's a few housekeeping notes. As you'll probably be aware, you'll all be muted throughout this for obvious reasons, but there is a question option, so you can pose questions through the question tab on your screen, and we'll save the questions to the end, and once Jon's finished, then we can take those questions in the Q&A session at the end. We'll also be sending out a questionnaire for your feedback, so we would appreciate you filling that in. But without further ado, I will now hand you over to your presenter, Jon Davies.
Thank you very much. I shall turn my camera off. Last thing you want is to see me. Okay, thanks very much, Tim. Thanks for the introduction. It's a true story about getting drunk, but I won't go into the details. So I thought I'd start off by doing a quick introduction very quickly as what RSK Wilding is about, just so that we know right from the outset. So this is oops, get the slides working. So we're a new service that's come into play in the last year or so, and we're bringing together landowners and developers to help deliver biodiversity net gain and also natural solutions to climate change. I'll talk in details about that, and other natural capital benefits as well. So that's the overall aim. And we use the principles of rewilding. We're shamelessly jumping on the bandwagon of rewilding, but also large-scale ecosystem recovery, because the idea is that we're going to work with farmers to create large natural landscapes with minimal intervention, and I put that in bold because we're not purist rewilding. It's not no intervention, it's low intervention, and the reason there is we want to do whatever intervention is required to kickstart biodiversity and other things, so we maximize the amount of natural capital benefit we can get from our rewilding sites. So we then use our expertise in natural capital and in routes to market in order to get funding for the biodiversity and carbon offsets that we're creating. And the whole purpose there is to provide a new revenue stream for landowners that is all focused on good, positive action for the environment. And it might look a bit pompous to say that we're this is our way of tackling the twin crises of climate change and biodiversity loss, but it is true. If an environmental consultancy can't get on and do something, then I don't know who can. So this slide, assuming it comes up, yep. So why rewilding specifically? I think hopefully many people on the call will recognize this photograph from NEP. So this is a farm down in Sussex where rewilding was trialed, started about 15-20 years ago now, and the owners, Isabella Tree and Charlie Burrell, Isabella wrote a fantastic book which was very inspirational for me, reading it, about how they managed to turn a farm that was marginal for growing things, was really difficult in fact to grow things because it's so clayey, and to turn that into this kind of wildlife haven over 15 years. And I would recommend the book to anyone. And then I was also inspired by another book that I read last year, which I would also recommend, which is English Pastoral by James Rebanks. And that's really, I wanted to get, I'm an ecologist, so I wanted to get the farmer's perspective on this. And he's a farmer in Cumbria. He recalls being a kid on the back of his tractor of his grandfather, and how wild everything seemed, how many curlews there were. That's quite a theme in the book. And you know, through the period of his dad being in charge, things really changed. It all became very mechanized. It was all chemicals, all the hedgerows were taken out, etc. And it's quite a redemptive book because towards the end, you know, things start to get better. He starts reinstating wildlife on his land. And then the last thing I wanted to say in terms of the inspiration for us setting this up, from my perspective, Tim's mentioned my tropical beetle stuff. It just seems to me a kind of a moral outrage that we're allowing things that have evolved over 250 million years to go extinct, and we need to do something about it. So this is an ant nest beetle, a porcid. It's very similar to the large blue butterfly, which people might be familiar with the biology of that, where the same thing happens here. It secretes a chemical from these bonkers antennae, which is massively attractive to ants. They then drag the beetle into the nest, and it kind of parasitizes the nest. This sort of evolution, just the structures on that creature, but also the behaviors, you know, this is amazing, this planet we live on, and we've got to do something about it. So I'll get off my soapbox, but that's really, you know, largely what this was all about, really trying to do our bit to reverse biodiversity loss. So we've actually set up 2 organizations. One is Nature Positive, which is set up by Stephanie Ray, and she will be doing a talk, watch this space, in a month's time, the next first Thursday talk. And Nature Positive is kind of the sister company to RSK Wilding. And with that organization, we go into large corporations and we talk about the biodiversity impacts of their activities. And a lot more companies are getting into that, very keen to understand the impacts of their supply chain, for instance. Where do they get the materials for making the things they make, or whatever it is? Is it associated with rainforest loss? All this sort of stuff. So there's that side of things. And as I say, do look out for Steph's talk. And then, you know, RSK Wilding is really the implementation bit. So the Nature Positive will find out what biodiversity offsets large companies might need to do, and RSK Wilding is the implementation part. We do the offsetting. And so what's the idea behind RSK Wilding? So on the one hand, so this is really your archetypal economic argument of supply and demand. So on the one hand, we've got developers who really want to achieve biodiversity net gain. We have companies who want to offset their carbon impacts. You might have private investors that are keen to make a difference with their money. There's a lot of that going on, including pension money. People want to invest in the right thing. And there's a general desire across the country now to do something about our natural capital, because our soils are massively degraded. Water quality is much lower than it should be. We've got floods going on all over the place. There's stuff that we need to do to restore our environment. So that's another important driver here. And then you've got this real traction around the term rewilding. Extinction Rebellion have raised the profile of biodiversity loss. Not everyone approves of the way they do it, but by heck, they've raised the profile, that's for sure. And then of course you've got net zero as an overarching approach that is driving this as well. People want to reduce the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So that's the demand side of the equation. The supply side is well, we've got a whole load of farmers across the UK who, going forward after Brexit, will maybe start to worry about revenue streams, funding streams. There is a new government measure coming in under the Agriculture Bill shortly called the Environmental Land Management Scheme, which is great, and I really like it. It's a government version of what we're proposing. It's public money for public good, so it is money from the government will be paid to do good environmental stuff on your land. But the question is whether there will be, you know, enough money from the government for landowners to do that, assuming landowners are very keen. And then you might have other landowners, maybe less pressured by finances on their farm, have large areas of land, but they really want to do something useful with their land as well. So you've got a lot of land, and landowners maybe wanting to do stuff and maybe make an income. And our role in RSK Wilding really is to bring the two together. So we're matching the supply with the demand. So who are we? Well, we're, you know, many people will say we are an unrivaled multidisciplinary offering, but I think we really are. RSK is a large company, an umbrella organization really, with a lot of organizations within it. And a lot of those have the skills that allow us to do a really good job as far as rewilding is concerned. So Tim and I both sit within RSK Biosensors, who are the ecology part of this. So we've got masses of experience in habitat mapping using the DEFRA biodiversity metric that I'll talk about in a bit, calculating biodiversity net gain for people, the the biodiversity footprinting that we talked about with Nature Positive, and then of course we do the monitoring, and that's really important, because if you're going to receive money from a developer who's offsetting their biodiversity, they're not just going to give it to you and go, there you go, off you pop. They do want to know that what we're doing with that money is enhancing biodiversity, is increasing biodiversity. So that monitoring is going to be imperative, and we've got a massive amount of experience in doing that, and we're working with UCL on new monitoring technology for monitoring biodiversity using sound recordings, which is quite exciting stuff that we're developing. And talking of expertise, we also have ADAS as part of the team, extremely well known as the experts in agriculture and working with landowners in this country. They provide so much advice for landowners, but they also have within their team natural capital specialists, so they have experience in running those metrics, and they deal with carbon offsetting as well. So there's a lot of experience within that team. And then we've got the guys on the ground, if you like. So RSK Habitats and Twig and Salix are 3 companies that do this sort of habitat creation work. So when we get to the point where we need to dig holes in the ground, create ponds, create wetlands, topsoil strip, and sow wildflower meadow mix, whatever it is, a fence around the outside, all of that stuff to set these places up to establish our rewilding sites, then we've got the guys to do that as well. And they can also do whatever vegetation management may be needed, although on the understanding that, of course, rewilding is largely low intervention. And then we've got the carbon, climate and sustainability team as well, who have further expertise in carbon offsetting. So we've got the whole of the package really within our teams. So what is it that the landowners are going to get out of this? Well, that figure we've got there, the map there, is a GIS layer from Natural England's Habitat Networks mapping, really useful GIS layer, which shows where it is most optimal to restore habitat. And it's largely to do with linking up isolated fragments of existing good quality land. So that sort of thing we can use in a feasibility study. So right from the start, we can do a high level desk-based assessment for a landowner, get a feel not just for the current ecological baseline within their land holding, but also in the wider area. And that's very important to understand how valuable rewilding might be in their particular location and beyond. And so we can get an idea of the potential for enhancing biodiversity, but also doing other things like offsetting carbon and other natural capital benefits I'll talk about. This feasibility study we can also overlay onto this map other layers, such as the agricultural land classification. So that's where you identify the agricultural productivity of the land. I'll say this once, and no, I won't. I'll say it lots of times. This is the first time I'm going to say that we do not want to take productive land out of production. That is not what our rewilding is about. So it is quite important to understand, where the marginal land is and where the more productive land is. Also to understand the soil type. That will give us an idea of what can be created in terms of habitats. Whether you're within a floodplain, obviously, if you're in a floodplain, that makes it harder to manage the land. And it also makes it easier for us to create wetland, of course. So, and then you've got the habitat networks as well, and the local nature recovery strategy. So all of these things give you an idea holistically and strategically of what the constraints and opportunities are for doing rewilding on a particular area of land in a sort of an objective way. And then, what we might do then is go into a bit more detail for a landowner and produce a rewilding strategy for them. So this is an example here, this figure that shows, gives an example of the sort of habitats we might create on what was previously arable land, so very low biodiversity. Hopefully you can see my cursor. The yellowy green area is a sort of archetypal scrubby grassland that you get from rewilding, so you don't really need to carry out much intervention there. The darker green here around the northern edge is tree planting or indeed natural regen. But the idea here in our strategy is to connect up these 2 areas. It's a bit fuzzy, so you can't see them, I'm afraid. Sorry about that. These are areas of ancient woodland that currently are just stranded in the middle of a massive arable field, so they're completely isolated. So, we would want to plant or regenerate woodland in order to link that up, not only to the along the outside of our site, but also down to this, which is a triple SI down to the south. So you're creating kind of green infrastructure, green links across the landscape. Then you've got this area here, which is wetland creation. Up the west of side of the site is a river. So creating a wetland adjacent to that gives you the kind of flood storage capacity. You're obviously creating really nice biodiverse habitat. You're also potentially helping clean the water. So there are all sorts of benefits, and of course wetland is very good for sequestering carbon. So there are all sorts of benefits you can get. And then the last example here is an area of wildflower meadow, which is more interventionist. You know, we would need to topsoil strip and sow with wildflower mix. And you might want to do that if you're near to buildings, you're creating something that is not just biodiverse, but looks nice. So, you know, there's a broad brush of things that we can do in order to enhance biodiversity and create something that is really good for biodiversity, but is attractive and has all sorts of other benefits. So this detailed strategy we can do for our clients, and it's aimed at optimizing biodiversity and these other benefits as much as possible. And as part of that strategy, you know, we can calculate the biodiversity units. So that is the currency that we use. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail, but for instance, on this site, you know, the number of biodiversity units currently before this scheme would be implemented is pretty low because it's all arable. With this in place, you know, you're talking about a considerable increase in the number of units, and we can calculate how much that means in monetary terms, which again I'll talk about in future. So we give the landowner an idea of the potential earning capacity, if you like, of rewilding their land. And then the next stage, the kind of the last bit of the jigsaw, is the implementation. And so if the landowner decides they want to press on with that rewilding plan, then we can and we find a local developer or some other source of funding to pay for that, then we can go ahead and start pressing on with implementing it on the ground. And as I said earlier, we've got people who can do that. It might be that the landowner, the farmer, is happy to do that themselves with a bit of guidance. Either way, you know, we're happy to do whatever works for the landowner. But ultimately, of course, the idea is that we're creating habitats that we're committing to. Because in order to get the funding, we have to commit to creating something of a certain level of biodiversity. So we might well need to be advising on the type of habitats to create, to actually get on and do it, to then manage those habitats and monitor, as I said earlier. And all of this kind of upfront capital cost, as well as the annual income that will go to the landowner, will come out of the money that comes from the developer or carbon offsets, or whatever it is. And so you have a funding arrangement that has a pot of money that distributes that over the course of maybe 20 or 30 years, which again I'll talk about in a bit more detail. So what do the developers and corporations get out of this? You may have heard of the term of insetting as opposed to offsetting. This is where you can do this sort of biodiversity enhancement on your own land. So that if you're a large organization that has non-operational land, it could be that you can do that on your own land, which is, you know, excellent because you wouldn't have to pay a landowner to buy the land or a revenue because it's your own land. So it's kind of safe as far as that's concerned. But really, in most cases, we're looking at offsetting. So, you know, for example, if you're a housing developer, like in the top picture there, you know, you would have an offset that you would need to find. It's pretty unlikely you'd offset, you'd be able to find 10% biodiversity net gain on your land. So we have a whole network of landowners that we're building up who we can then do that offsetting on. One of the other advantages for developers is the corporate social responsibility that you get. You know, they are doing great stuff. It's not just paying some money for biodiversity offsetting. There's all of these other natural capital benefits. ESG is environmental sustainability and governance, so that's a kind of more of a international UN thing where funding is you know, governed by these requirements to be sustainable. So you've got all these other things that are good add-ons, if you like, and then we can of course produce a report on biodiversity and climate, the progress that we've made on all of our client sites over, you know, by year, to show to investors, to show to shareholders and employees the great stuff that the company is doing. And I think, you know, ultimately it's not just about paying to have biodiversity net gain done so you get it off your books and you can get on with your development. There's a whole wider benefit that can be achieved achieve through this. I think that's what's kind of exciting about it. So that's kind of the process, but what do we need really for this to actually work on the ground? And there are 5 things that I flagged up. The first one is that we need a legal and policy framework that encourages this to happen. That's obviously important to have those drivers. At the very highest level, a global level, we've got the Convention on Biological Diversity's post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which is very much pushing us towards towards addressing the biodiversity crisis, which is great. That's a kind of overarching steer. Then we've got the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which may be a new one to some people, which is really about making sure that that development and investment that is in practices that have an adverse effect on the environment, that may be destroying rainforests or whatever, those have to be disclosed so that people investing know that's going on. So that's I think going to be a bit of a game changer. We've also got the Environment Bill, which is where a biodiversity net gain and that becoming mandatory has come through that bill, or is going to through the Act when it comes to fruition shortly, hopefully. So biodiversity net gain is here to stay. It will be mandated. So this is stuff that will need to be done. So you know, the landscape is changing in more ways than one, really. And then we've got the Agriculture Bill. That's where the Environmental Land Management scheme is going to come through. So that is changing the way things are. Our land is managed with much more of a focus on environmentally friendly land management. And then ultimately we've got the whole drive towards net zero carbon, which is, you know, underpinning all of this, that we all need to do something about carbon in the atmosphere. The second thing we need is monetary value for biodiversity. And this is one of the great things I think about all of this, is that at last biodiversity, which was never valued, does have some value, and people understand there is a monetary cost to it, and that is really going to help us in what we're trying to achieve here. So if we put it really crudely, this area of land is very low in biodiversity, and if you turn it into something like that, then that equals cash. So that's a very kind of crude assessment of what this is about. But to put it a bit more flesh on the bones, I talked about biodiversity units a minute ago. So this is the DEFRA biodiversity metric, which calculates this for us, which is very clever. It takes the type of habitat you've got, the area of that habitat, how rare it is, what status it's in, the condition, and it throws that all into a calculator, and it throws out how many biodiversity units you've got on your land. So the one on the left will be very few biodiversity units because there's not a lot going on. The one in the middle will be quite a lot more. And a developer under the biodiversity net gain requirements will need to demonstrate there is 10% more biodiversity on the land than there was beforehand, which is quite difficult, hence the need for offsetting. And fortunately, this currency actually has a market price. It will potentially, because it's a market and it's a very immature market at the moment, it could go up, it could go down. But DEFRA set in their kind of original paper on this a rough idea of about 10,000, sort of 9,000 to 15,000, I think was the range, pounds per biodiversity unit. And you can, I've seen various studies where you can maybe create about 10 biodiversity units on a hectare. If you make a hectare really biodiverse, then you can create between 15 to 20 maybe biodiversity units. So if you've got 5 to 10 hectares, let's say, and you're really creating a lot of biodiversity, then you might be able to create 100 biodiversity units. That's worth £1 million. So that's, as a landowner, you'll start thinking, well, that's interesting. That's quite a bit of money. So that is something to be aware of as a landowner. The corollary of that is if you're a developer, then it'll cost you £1 million. If you decide to build a housing estate, for instance, on that middle picture, then it's going to potentially cost £1 million, and that's before you even buy the land and before you build any houses. And all of this kind of the final piece, I guess, on the monetary value is it all gets written into a contract, kind of a financial contract, a conservation covenant that provides an annual income to the landowner. It pays for the upfront costs, and that will last for anything from 20 to 30 plus years. Who knows? It'll vary on a case-by-case basis. So the next thing we need for this to work, I think, is for landowners to be keen to dedicate land to it, and that's obviously very important that this is attractive to landowners. The first thing to say there is we need to get away from this idea that it's all about wolves, that rewilding is all about wolves and other apex predators. It's really not. I mean, there's a reason we chose a beetle as our logo. This is a bottom-up approach. It's all about, you know, species diversity. That's plants and insects more than anything else. We're trying to create habitats that are very varied and diverse. Yes, there will be a place for things like wolves and lynx, but we've got to get away from that narrative that that's what rewilding is all about. And also, I think we need to talk. We need to get farmers understanding that we're not going to suddenly take away all the land and we're going to rewild it and off you pop. You know, that's not what we're suggesting. There'll be some landowners that will be happy for us to take it over and take the whole land holding. But for others, they'll want to continue farming the land. And as I've said before, we don't want to take productive land out of production, and we don't want to stop farmers farming if they want to farm. So there will be farmers at the other end of the extreme who maybe just do a bit of rewilding around the outside of their fields. There's a wide variety of different approaches that can be adopted. And then the next one I think to mention is this ELM that we were talking about, the Environmental Land Management Scheme. How does our rewilding, kind of the private sector version of rewilding, if you like, compare with the ELM? Can you do it on the same farm? And it might be that you can. And we're very early days at the moment. I mean, the ELM hasn't even started, but it could be that a farmer can get some money from the government for doing certain things on his land and get a kind of a top up from us for doing something else that isn't part of the ELM scheme. You know, we'll have to review that on a case-by-case basis, but it could alternatively be that some farms are done with ELM and some with private enterprise such as us. But, you know, a key thing to get across to landowners is this will be an annual income for implementing the plan. It's relatively low intervention as far as the landowner is concerned, which is good. The costs, the enormous costs that you can get from having to buy fertilizers and pesticides won't be there anymore. So, you know, you've got to think of the benefits financially as far as that's concerned as well. Another thing is we're bringing together farmers working together to have a bigger impact. If we can get farm clusters of farmers working, teaming up so that you've got a bigger area that is being rewilded, that has knock-on benefits as far as the environment is concerned. I'll talk about it in a bit. And the last thing I want to get over as far as agriculture is concerned is that restoring the soil is part of this. It is, you know, our soil is degrading terribly. And it could be that some of these rewilded areas in 20 or 30 years' time could be ploughed up again and turned back to agriculture. We're trying to rescue the soil. So that means that some of these areas may well be farmed in the future. As an ecologist, I'd obviously prefer as much of it to be kept wild as possible. But, you know, that is part of this. That is part of what we're talking about here is restoring the soil and making agriculture sustainable. So the fourth thing that we need is an overarching kind of strategic approach to this. So you've seen the figure on the left there. Top right is a flood warning map. So that shows where there's high flood risk, obviously, and then you've got the ALC, the Agricultural Land Classification Map, where you've down the bottom there that shows the different grades of land and the productivity of the land. So we need to bring all of these things together, plus other layers in GIS, to have a very objective, sensible, common sense approach to rewilding in the best places to do it. So yes, you know, any landowner that comes to us, we can talk about rewilding their land, but ultimately we want to focus our attention wherever possible in the best places to do it, so you get the most environmental gain or bang for your buck, if you like. So that's a very important part of what we're doing. It's quite objective and strategic. And then the last one is a collaborative approach. I think it's really important that we all work together on this, because it's you know, what we're trying to achieve here is extremely important. We've got lots of vested interests, landowners, obviously, businesses, the developers who are paying for it, consultancies such as ourselves, NGOs who are doing this and advising on this, government agencies, local planning authorities, lots of people all working together on this. And I think it's really important to get across, again, I don't want to be pompous about this, but climate change is on us and we've got to do something about it. The issues are too important for large egos and petty rivalries to get in the way of all of this. So we've got to all work together, and I think it's really exciting that we have the opportunity to do so, and I'm really looking forward to doing that. And then the last thing, of course, is that by working together, we can achieve more. We can be more efficient. We've got all sorts of skills within those organizations in the top there that can provide different things as far as rewilding is concerned. So we've got lots of skills. And of course, there's that issue of farm clusters I talked about. So you're also getting more people involved in neighboring farms. So whilst this originated, I guess, because I'm an ecologist, it started as a biodiversity net gain thing, and that was the initial focus. You know, we really are. We can throw in all these other things, and I think it's very important to flag those up in a bit more detail. So then the carbon side of things is absolutely imperative. There's a phrase that you may have heard: natural solutions to climate change is becoming much more popular now, and that is where you're creating habitats to basically suck carbon out of the air, and of course you're creating great habitats at the same time. So 3 examples here of how we can do that really effectively, whilst also increasing biodiversity. So peatland restoration is probably the best one, frankly. If you re-wet peatland, then you stop it emitting carbon for starters, and then it is capturing more carbon at the same time. So that's massively important. Creates lovely habitat as well, as in comparison to kind of dry, eroded peat. Then you've got tree planting that we're all kind of familiar with, or indeed natural regeneration. That's obviously a way of absorbing carbon. That's the kind of the standard way of offsetting carbon, I guess. And then you've got wetland creation, which, yes, is normally done for other reasons, maybe creating nice habitat or flood storage or cleaning water or whatever it is. But wetland habitats are also terrific at storing carbon, so they're a great alternative sequestering process. And on the subject of water, we've got what I call the watery benefits of all of this process, this rewilding as well. So our rewilding sites will also be filtering the water. You know, you've got thick matted grass, tussocky grass, woodland, scrub. All of this will slow the water as it goes off the land. A compacted sheep graze pasture, the water flows off really quickly compared to this sort of natural habitat. So you're slowing the water, you've got more even flows, so there's less flooding. It's also cleaning the water as it goes into the rivers. So it's doing all sorts of fantastic good as far as the water environment is concerned. Beavers, of course, do a similar thing. That's something I think most people are more or less happy to see reintroduced. They hold back the water. And then you've got things such as managed retreat, which is a great way of rewilding on the coast, not investing in massive seawalls, which take up a lot of concrete, which is awful for carbon, obviously, and is very expensive. You can sacrifice some of the land, but of course the landowner will be paid for the money saved for not building the wall, but also they'll get paid potentially for biodiversity offsets and carbon as well. So there are all sorts of benefits from doing managed retreat, and I think that's something we're definitely keen to look at in detail. And then another of these other advantages is access to the countryside. You know, our rewilding sites are not going to be sacrosanct nature reserves. They're going to be there for people to enjoy. Really keen for that to happen. Things like forest school, where children can get out into the environment, really get to understand how important it is and really enjoy it. Things like safaris. That's a picture again from NEP, where people can go on safaris to look at the wildlife in these rewilded areas, which I think is really exciting to do that in this country. And of course, it brings in more revenue for the landowner. And things like wild swimming as well, which is very popular and very, you know, people love to just get out into the outdoors. So these are all, you know, additional benefits I think are really worth flagging up. And then, you know, on top of all that, there is, you know, I think we're allowed to have a kind of a warm, fuzzy feeling for the fact that we're doing the right thing. You know, we are doing the right thing. That's the best picture of a warm, fuzzy feeling I could get. You know, we're doing the right thing, and I think we should be proud of that. But there are all these other benefits as well. So that's all the kind of the good stuff. But I do think there are a couple of pitfalls we need to be aware of. The first thing we need to be aware of is wolves, because everyone knows wolves are extremely scary. I mean, I talked about them a minute ago. That's a fairly flippant picture, but you know, we've got to get away from the narrative of wolves and rewilding, because that's not what we're all about. So we've got to get away from that. We also need to take the narrative away from this idea that we are rewilding the whole landscape of England and we're not going to have any food. You know, that I think I've said 4 times now that we're not wanting to rewild productive land. That's not the aim. So we certainly don't want to take too much of that away. And then kind of the last one is, we don't want to overpromise to landowners. Yes, our job is to find this funding and match it up to land, but we can't overcommit. We would do a rewilding strategy, and then we will try and find the money, but we can't promise a landowner that we're going to make you a millionaire in 3 years time. So we mustn't overpromise. But there's plenty of interest out there from people wanting to offset carbon in this country, and of course biodiversity, and that again means that a lot of people are going to have to find biodiversity offsets. So I think there's plenty of a market out there for this to happen. And whilst we've got a picture of dollar bills being stuffed into the ground, I think we need to just be a bit aware that we don't turn this into big business. We don't, this is rewilding. This is a good thing to do. Yes, it is, I think, absolutely fantastic that the market and capitalism takes this on. I mean, for goodness sake, capitalism has led to a lot of habitat being destroyed. It would be great if we can turn it to our advantage, and I think we absolutely should. So we shouldn't be afraid to have a business set around doing this. And just finally then, very quickly, 3 example projects. So we're working with the Central Chilterns AONB, Area of Outstanding Natural Beauty, working on 8 farms. There are a couple of other consultancies working with us on other farms in the cluster as well. And that's where we're talking to farmers. Some of them are maybe a bit cautious and happy to just rewild maybe around the edge of the fields. Others are rather more adventurous and quite keen to rewild quite a lot of their land. So it's really exciting to see how that varies from farmer to farmer, but also to fit it into the wider landscape. And you're in a great landscape in the Chilterns there, where we're looking to have a really strategic approach to rewilding and connecting up areas of existing, beech woodland and other nice habitats. And then another really exciting venture that we're working on is to work with Wild East. And so we're a delivery partner for this group of fantastic group of committed landowners in East Anglia, who have set up a map of dreams, which is encouraging people across East Anglia, whether you've only got a small garden or a big land ownership of maybe 5,000 acres, whatever it is, to commit 20% of your land to rewilding. And it's a fantastic thing. And we're very proud to be working with them, and also very excited that we've got links in the east of England with large scale developers, where we're really confident we can get money to match up requirements from offsetting biodiversity net gain with these landowners who are so committed. So that's a very exciting venture that we're working on. And then the last one is a project in Yorkshire where we're working with a company that does a lot of gas flaring, and they want to offset their carbon. And rather than just pay for offsets that go off somewhere else and that's just kind of parked and they just kind of pay it as an environmental tax, they really want to get involved with rewilding in this country, so that they're not just offsetting their carbon, they know that they're doing great stuff for biodiversity and cleaning up the water and all the rest of it, and they can see it happening on their doorstep. And I think that's something that's going to happen more and more in carbon offsetting. We've been speaking to a lot of companies that are interested in offsetting in this country, and I think that's a very exciting part of this going forward. And then that is quite enough from me. I will leave with my details and a little visual gag for anyone who's a Game of Thrones fan. You've got my details there. Do have a look at the website and feel free to drop us an email. We are now, I think, Tim, going to move on to some questions, and I'm more than happy to follow up those questions afterwards as well. Right.
Thank you very much, John. Yeah, I think most people will agree it's a really exciting area of development in the environmental sector, and as John said, almost certainly part of the solution. As John said, we're now going to have some questions. We've got quite a few that have come in, which is great, but feel free to keep asking because I'm picking the more interesting ones. So if yours gets read out, then that's because I think it's interesting.
I think it's worth saying we said, Tim, this was due to finish at 1:15. We're obviously happy to go on until 1:30, so we will keep going with the questions. Anyway, far away.
Yep. Okay, this is from Anna. She says, you said landowners would get an annual income from doing this on their land. Where is that funding coming from?
Well, what will happen is that we will calculate for our client, a developer, say how much biodiversity they need to find. They then make a contribution, let's say to Wild East, and that goes into the pot, which is then used to draw up an agreement to pay the landowner and to pay for the capital costs of fencing off the land, restoring any habitat. So all of that comes out of the pot of money. So you identify how much money can be achieved through the biodiversity that you're going to create on the land, and that is agreed that this is what we're aiming to achieve. We work out how many biodiversity units that is, multiply that by £10,000 or whatever the going rate is. That is the amount of money that is in the pot to do that, and it will last for 20 or 30 years, whatever the length of the conservation covenant is. So that's where it comes from. And there may be other sources of income as well from carbon offsetting, and there is this concept that you can stack, potentially you can stack these alternative income streams, so that, you know, the more we can get, you know, you don't want to double count, but you can get further income from other approaches as well.
Okay, thanks, John. They are coming in thick and fast now, so apologies if I don't get around to mentioning your question. I should say, John, without wanting to overinflate your ego, that there was a lot of really nice comments about it being a great presentation. So thank you, people, for saying that. How will contracts be upheld? So this is from Vicky. How will contracts be upheld? Will there be a legal body of some sort monitoring that agreements are adhered to?
That's a fantastic question. We're certainly working with Pure Leapfrog on this, who are a company who look at carbon offsetting, where we're looking at a validation process for the carbon side of things. As far as, you know, there will be legal agreements. You will be, as a landowner, obliged to monitor the land. That's part of what we would be doing to demonstrate that you are achieving the biodiversity that's required. And if not, yes, there will have to be some sort of regulation body to kind of police that. At the moment, it looks like local planning authorities will have some sort of role in that, because after all, biodiversity net gain will come about through planning applications that are consented by the local planning authority, and they will have various rewilding sites or offsetting sites within their area that they are sort of ultimately overseeing. So it might be that local planning authority are involved. I think it'll have to be some sort of new mechanism that is created. I don't know how it would be done for ELM, for example. You know, it'll be a similar thing with government, that you'd have to make sure that the people getting money from the ELM scheme are also doing what they're supposed to be doing, and there would be advisors going out. So I think there will, over time, there will become a body that goes out and validates what's being done.
Okay, thank you. And just a link to that, actually, John, is a question here from Patrick saying, do you know when the details of the ELM will be brought into law?
Well, it's being trialed at the minute, and I think they were talking about 7 years, which seems a terribly long way away. That doesn't mean, you know, now that we've left EU, all landowners suddenly scratching around because they've lost, you know, 80% of their income from subsidies. The basic payments and the countryside stewardship scheme is going to keep going until, so there will be a handover, a peaceful transition of power, if you like, if I could use that phrase, on this day of all days. But it will take time, because they need to test the process, make sure it's working, make sure this idea of having, you know, farm advisors going out and checking it, that it all works. So I think it will take time, but it is something that the government are committed to in their 25-year plan and in the agriculture bill. So I guess it's a case of watch this space, but it won't be as rapid as maybe you hope. And so organisations like us will probably fill the void for the time being whilst that's underway, or whilst that's being developed.
Okay. A question here from Cara. Could local authorities put forward their land and receive the funding?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think, you know, I talked about collaboration and, you know, how many organisations could be involved with this. It's a joint effort, and there already are local authorities that are doing this. I think there's a bit of a conflict of interest issue with local authorities that will have to be dealt with in a sensitive way, because obviously if the local authority is granting planning consent to a development and saying, yes, you can have consent if you offset your biodiversity on our land, there's a bit of a potential conflict of interest there. But at the same time, I think it's a great way of local authorities maximizing the value of land that they own, and a lot of local authorities do own a lot of land, and doing great stuff for the environment at the same time. So I think that is something that is likely to happen.
Okay, the next one's from Sunny, and they ask, oh, really interesting, thank you, that's good. How can you calculate the biodiversity units when the principle of rewilding is open-ended and natural process driven with no sure outcome?
That, again, a very good question. There'll have to be some give and take. I mean, there is habitat, within the UK HAB calculation, the habitat mapping that we have that underpins the biodiversity metric, the DEFRA biodiversity metric. You do have habitat categories that are akin to the sort of habitat that will emerge naturally through rewilding, this kind of scrubby mosaic of grassland and scrub. So you will be able to say in your conservation covenant that at 50% of the land we're just going to leave to be like that, and so that will be something that you can calculate, and that in 20 years time, because of what's happened at NEP, we can be fairly confident that in 20 years time just leaving it will turn into something of value. We will be monitoring biodiversity. As I said, we've got this kind of noise monitoring that we're looking at in terms of biodiversity, monitoring the sounds within a field. So if you imagine a hay meadow that's buzzing with wildlife, lots of different species, that makes a very different sound, much more varied sound than a field, an improved grassland that's got very little in it. So we will be doing that sort of monitoring just to check. And I think there might be a bit of kind of remedial tweaking as we go along, perhaps. But ultimately, if you are creating woodland through planting, then you're fairly sure of the species mix that you're creating in that woodland, so you know what you're creating there. And as long as in 5, 10, 20 years time you're seeing how it's progressing, and it is more or less progressing to what the end state is meant to be, then that will be sufficient to demonstrate that you're achieving the biodiversity that you're meant to be. But it is a good question. It hasn't been tested, and it'll go on trust to a degree, but that's the point of monitoring, really. And it's a bit of suck it and see, because we haven't really done this in this country very much.
You keep giving me the ins to the next questions, John. We haven't done it in this country very much, but this question is, have we done, or does RSK Wilding get involved in Scotland?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, Steph and I are looking at a GIS of Scotland for rewilding, for optimizing where to do rewilding in Scotland, which is quite exciting. Tim, you and I have been talking to Paul Lister, who owns Allerdale, which is one of the big rewilding sites in Scotland. He's very keen on reintroducing wolves. I know I went on about wolves. It's not really what we're about. That said, Scotland would be the place where that might happen if it does happen, because it is massive and open, and they've got a deer problem. So yeah, Scotland definitely is somewhere we would be looking to do this. I said earlier, I think that the biodiversity net gain and the environment bill, actually I didn't say it, but it is an England thing, but it will, I think biodiversity net gain will become a UK-wide thing. There are a lot of organisations that are adopting it voluntarily anyway, and I think in time it will become mandatory in Scotland and Northern Ireland and Wales. And so yes, I think it will happen, and we're very keen, because there's an awful lot of moorland up there which isn't particularly exciting for wildlife, and is dry and desiccating, and needs to be reinstated as peatland, damp peatland. So there's massive opportunity for carbon and wildlife, and there are quite a lot of grouse shoots that are starting to think of divesting. So there's opportunities there, and there's an awful lot of land.
Okay, there's a theme here of quite a few questions that I'll sort of try and encapsulate with one of the questions, but the theme's very much about the scale here and who can get involved. So this question is there a scheme like the Transition Initiative that looks at wilding gardens in towns and cities? And in extension to that, John, it's are we only talking about big landowners here, or can small landowners club together or do it on their own?
I'm happy to rewild for anyone, pretty much. I mean, one of the great things about Wild East is that they are encouraging people from that very small scale to do it. I think it's unlikely that people at that tiny scale will, be matched up with developers as being paid for rewilding their garden. I think that's probably pretty unlikely. But there will be guidance certainly out there for good stuff to do. I mean, there's always been good advice on how to do good wildlife gardening, in your garden. But you know, that example that I showed you of the rewilding plan, that's 50 hectares, so it's not massive. That's not a huge area of land. So you know, we can work on quite small areas, or some of the areas, some of the landowners in Wild East have, you know, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 acres maybe, so much bigger areas of land. Yes, we can achieve more the bigger, but if you team up with people, I think that's a good way to do it. So if you really want to get involved, then talk to your mates. You know, I've talked to landowners who have not very much land, but once they team up with their neighbours, then we're looking at 4,000 acres, and it's starting to be, you know, a proper landscape scale approach. And that is something that we're keen on, because this whole idea that, you know, the whole theory of bigger, better, wilder, that's our tagline, you know, comes from the Lawton Review. The bigger these areas are, the better they are, and the ecosystem processes are allowed to kick in, and you know, the landscape kind of looks after itself. So yeah, sorry, a long rambling answer as usual.
There's a couple here that I'll conflate. The first question was, can house builders make as much money or more by dropping a few houses and rewilding? But connected to that, I think, is that Mark says some local authorities are quoting £35,000 per net gain unit. This exacerbated by the 30-year management fees, insurance provisions, and high inflation assumptions. This is very off-putting to developers and could threaten the establishment of the initiative, which otherwise we welcome. So I'm assuming he's a housing developer or linked. How can the guidance provide better clarity as to the value of that unit?
Goodness. It is such an immature market, it's really difficult to say. I think, you know, I've heard of those sorts of levels for biodiversity units, and it just seems inflated. It's really difficult to tell how the market will react to this. But it should be the case that once competition comes in, it becomes more cost effective. But equally, you know, if a local authority thinks it's worth that, and that's what they're going to say is required in order for you to get your consent, then that's what you're lumbered with. But hopefully there'll be kind of a ratcheting down of this when it becomes apparent that we're not going to get any housing because the biodiversity stumps it. That's the last thing we want. So we do want it to be competitive. I think to tackle the first part of that question, if a housing developer is choosing to develop on land that is already quite good for biodiversity, then yeah, you might be better off hiving off, you know, a corner of the site that is particularly valuable and don't build on it, because if you did, that will be quite costly. And so I think it will focus the mind of where you choose to build houses, and it will focus your mind on the design of the layout of your housing developments as well. But I really don't want this to stop housing happening. Absolutely not. But it is something that's being mandated, and I think it's something that we'll work our way through, you know, as things develop. It's quite difficult when it's such a young market and such a young system. But we all together, you know, that collaboration I was talking about, local planning authority to consenting schemes, developers, us as consultants, NGOs, we all need to make sure we work together to make sure that housing isn't entirely compromised by this, but that we do get biodiversity offsetting done properly.
Thanks, John. Okay, probably got time for a couple more questions. How hands-off is the management required? Plus, are large herbivores considered for management as at NEP? So that's from Paul.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I visited NEP. I camped at NEP last summer. It was brilliant. It's just such a great thing. So I would recommend anyone to go and see it. Yeah, I'm very lucky to have longhorn cows in the field opposite me here, and they are fantastic beasts. So I am thinking that they are a great animal to use. They use Tamworth pigs also at NEP. It is part of what the management would be. Yes, I talked about habitat management, but I would imagine that in most circumstances, the cost of the habitat management and the amount will be very little. The bulk of any intervention will be upfront kind of capital costs in kick-starting the environment, as I've said, you know, digging out ponds to create wetlands, and in such a way, you know, we've got the experience in-house to do this in such a way that you create it that it then can look after itself. So we don't want, you know, a big chunk of the money to be going to, you know, pay us to do habitat management. Tim will probably say yes, we do. You know, it's all about money for the landowners, revenue for the landowners. We will get revenue for monitoring, and that's important, and for doing some of the upfront stuff. But ultimately, I don't think the habitat management will be much. It'll, the whole point is that these large mammals are replacing the aurochs from prehistory and the wild boar, and they're kind of reinstating habitat without our help.
Okay, there's a couple of questions here I'll probably add together. I think they're connected. One's from Dan and one from Robert. Given all the pressures on land within the UK, what options are there for rewilding brownfield sites within urban areas? And then the other question I think is linked is, are you looking at opportunities associated with vacant and derelict land?
Yeah, I was on a call with someone a couple of days ago actually about areas of land that they own within towns, and they're thinking, yeah, but that won't be useful, will it? I was going, yes it will, because a big part of this is the access to the countryside and the access to wildlife for people. Now, if you're in the middle of town, then getting out into the countryside probably isn't very easy. So rewilding areas within towns is absolutely a fantastic thing to do. Yeah. So that's, those will be the smaller sites that we talked about earlier. But equally, I'm very keen to do rewilding on the outskirts of big towns, so it's easy for people to get to bigger sites where they can properly explore large areas, go for cycle rides and go for big walks in wild areas. But it's a mix of the two. But yeah, certainly getting wildlife into towns is a great idea.
Okay, well, I'm going to end with one more question, which is a bit more philosophical potentially. And I've come across this question a number of times with people I've spoken to as well. So it's obviously something that plays on people's minds and perhaps crosses the cultures here a little bit. But the natural capital, or the term natural capital, implies that it's a resource rather than a way to stop mass extinction. Should we be using different terms to stop the loss of biodiversity? Wow,
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, that's partly why I had my slide about not overly commercializing this. It's also why I mentioned the fact that it is important to use capitalism and the way it works to our benefit. For centuries, it's done the opposite, and it's led to habitat destruction all over the world. So I think I do get that philosophical point, and that's why I said I don't want to over-commercialize it. But at the same time, this is an emergency, and if we can use investors and our power to work with large corporations and mobilize people at a very big scale, then we can do something. If we pussyfoot around too much and we're too worried about that, then it won't happen. So the natural capital part of this, the monetization, I think, yeah, bring it on. Let's use it to our advantage, because ultimately we will be able to rewild and reinstate way, way more if we use capitalism rather than shy away from it.
Okay, thanks, John. I think we'll end the questions there. But also, that's quite a nice segue into me reminding everybody that the next month's First Thursday talk will be by Stephanie Ray, and talking about our new company, Nature Positive, which is very much geared towards talking to big business and to help them minimise their impact on biodiversity. So yes, I just wanted to say thanks to John one more time. Thanks to you all for joining. Also, a reminder that the questionnaire will be coming out via email after this, and we would appreciate it if you took the time to fill that in to help us refine what we're doing. I hope you've all enjoyed it, and we'll see you next month. Thanks very much.
Cheerio.